My sister filed a complaint to have my engineering license permanently revoked. I sat through the entire hearing without saying a single word. Until the board chairwoman opened the secondary file, looked at the document inside and quietly excused herself from the room. That was when I understood. The trap had already closed, not around me, around them. My sister stood at that podium with the practiced grief of someone who had rehearsed it in the mirror. She had worn a soft dove-gray blazer, careful, understated, believable. My mother sat 2 rows behind her with a handkerchief pressed to her lips. My father stared at the carpet between his shoes. The Texas Engineering Licensing Board conference room smelled of recycled air and old coffee. Chairwoman Kessler sat at the head of the long table, flanked by 4 board members whose expressions ranged from politely neutral to visibly uncomfortable. My sister's attorney had just submitted the complaint file. 62 pages of carefully assembled lies, claiming that my professional engineer license had been fraudulently obtained, and that my firm had been running active contracts under false credentials, endangering public safety on a municipal infrastructure level. I had not said a single word. The chairwoman opened the secondary folder. Her expression shifted. The color left her face in a slow, visible drain. She set the folder down. She pushed her chair back. She excused herself from the room without explanation, and the heavy door clicked shut behind her. My sister turned to look at me across the conference table. She was still holding onto the edges of her performance, the sorrowful brow, the carefully manufactured concern. But beneath it, I could see the first fracture of uncertainty spreading across her face, like a hairline crack in old concrete. She thought I was finished. She had absolutely no idea the trap had already snapped shut. The certified letter arrived on a Thursday morning, slid under the door of my Dallas office, sometime before I got in. My assistant found it, propped against my coffee mug, and left it there, with the wide-eyed expression of someone who recognized the return address and had decided the rest was not her business. The return address was the Texas State Board of Professional Engineers. I read it standing at my desk, still in my coat. The formal complaint was 38 pages. My sister's signature appeared on the primary declaration, neat and deliberate. My brother-in-law's name appeared 3 times in the supporting documentation. As a concerned community member, with direct knowledge of potential public safety risks. My mother had signed a single-page affidavit, swearing that to the best of her knowledge. She had never personally seen a diploma or licensing certificate in my possession. My father's name was not on anything at all. I set the letter down on my desk. I took off my coat. I hung it on the hook behind the door the way I do every morning, slowly, deliberately, because when I let myself move fast in moments like that, I break things. Then I drove to my parents' house in Frisco. My mother opened the front door before I could knock. She had clearly been expecting me, which told me everything I needed to know before she said a word. She was wearing her good cardigan. The cream one she saves for church, and doctor appointments and situations she has already decided require composure. Her hands were folded in front of her at the waist, measured, prepared. I held up the complaint letter. She sighed, not a surprised sigh, a weary, theatrical exhalation that was supposed to signal maternal love in conflict with maternal duty. She said she was sorry I had to find out this way. But my sister and my brother-in-law were worried about certain patterns they had observed. She said sometimes, when people close to us cannot see their own blind spots, the people who love them most have to be willing to step in before real harm is done. I asked her if she understood what perjury carried in terms of criminal exposure. Her expression changed immediately, not to confusion, but to cold irritation. She told me I was always so combative. She said this was exactly the kind of behavior that had worried the family. She said my sister had done nothing but try to protect me, and I always found a way to make her the villain in every story. Behind her, my father appeared in the hallway. He saw my face. He saw what was in my hand. He turned around and walked back toward the kitchen without a word. I drove home. I sat in my car in the parking garage beneath my building for 24 minutes. I was not crying, I was thinking. Because my family had never fully understood one thing about me. When they hurt me, I do not fall apart. I go very quiet, and I start asking why. My sister did not operate out of pure spite. She never had. She needed something, and the timing was not coincidental. My brother-in-law's development firm had been circling the Calder Creek Bridge retrofit for nearly 2 years. A $3.4 million municipal contract involving the structural rehabilitation of a 1960s-era overpass in one of the fastest-growing suburbs north of Fort Worth. I had submitted my firm's bid in the fall. 3 weeks before the complaint landed on my doorstep, the city announced that my firm had won. If my license was suspended or revoked during an active board investigation, the city would be legally obligated to rebid the project. My brother-in-law's firm was already on the approved vendor list. He was positioned, he was ready, he just needed me out of the way. My sister had given him the mechanism, and my mother had given him the affidavit. I called a private investigator named Griff the next morning. He had been recommended to me 18 months earlier by a colleague in the construction litigation world, described as someone who worked quietly and charged fairly and never overcomplicated things. He answered on the second ring and did not ask unnecessary questions. We met that evening at a barbecue place off Greenville Avenue. He was already in the back booth when I arrived, a paper basket of brisket in front of him, and a legal notepad beside his coffee. He had the kind of face that had seen too many versions of the same story to be surprised by any of them. I laid out everything I knew. He listened without interrupting once, which I appreciated. When I finished, he tapped his pen against the notepad and asked, "Physical trail or digital?" I said, "Both, most likely." He told me to give him 48 hours and to not contact anyone in my family in the meantime. He said he'd be in touch. That night, alone in my apartment, I pulled out a fireproof lockbox I kept on the top shelf of my closet and hadn't opened in 3 years. Inside, my original PE license certificate issued by the state of Texas 8 years ago, my undergraduate transcripts from UT Austin, my NCE's examination results with scores, my continuing education logs, updated annually, 8 years of documentation, clean and sequential, every page exactly where it was supposed to be. I set the folder on my coffee table and looked at it for a long time. And then a memory hit me with the particular force of something long buried suddenly breaking the surface. I was 23 years old. I had just been accepted into the competitive accelerated engineering cohort at UT, a program funded by a private infrastructure foundation that covered full tuition plus a stipend, and placed graduates directly into partnered firms. I had applied without telling my family because I had learned by then that announcing hope in that house only created a target. I came home for dinner the night the acceptance arrived. I told them at the table, trying to keep my voice steady, trying not to want too much from the moment. My mother looked at the letter. Then she looked at my sister, who was 26 at the time, recently out of a relationship she'd expected to lead to marriage, working a job she resented, quietly miserable in the particular way that required an audience. My mother said, and I have replayed this sentence so many times it has worn grooves into my memory, she said, in her gentlest voice, "Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could find something like this for your sister too? She could really use something good right now." She did not mean the scholarship. She meant the attention, the celebration, the feeling in the room. For the next 3 weeks, my sister received the congratulations that were not hers, the dinners out, the calls to relatives, the soft, general story my mother told to anyone who would listen about one of her daughters going places. Deliberately, carefully non-specific, so that the warmth could be redirected. I enrolled in the program alone. I showed up to orientation without a party, without a family photo on my phone, without anyone watching. I built what I built without a foundation anyone else had poured for me. That memory burned in my chest sitting on my apartment floor, the night before I was supposed to be professionally destroyed. And then it stopped burning. It turned into something cold and structural. Something I could build on. I put the documents back in the lockbox and went to bed. Griff called me the following evening. He said what he had was better delivered in person. We met at the same barbecue place. He was already in the booth and he slid a plain manila envelope across the table before I had even taken my coat off. 3 items inside. First, a long-lens photograph of my brother-in-law entering the North Austin field office of the Texas Licensing Board at 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, a date when that office was officially closed for an all-staff retreat. Second, a photograph of the building's physical visitor log taken on the same night, showing his signature in block letters, time-stamped by the overnight security guard. Third, a printed analysis from a digital forensics contact, showing that the formal complaint against me had been submitted electronically from an IP address registered to my brother-in-law's development firm during the exact same late-night window. He had not hacked anything. He had not needed to. He had simply paid attention to the timeline, followed the physical footprint my brother-in-law had left in plain sight, and let the documentation do the work. Griff pushed the envelope fully across the table and folded his hands. He said, "Get this to your attorney before the hearing. Make sure she knows exactly what she's walking into." He stood up, pocketed his fee, and said he was going to be out of town for a while, and that I should not reach out until things were resolved. He said it the way someone says goodbye, when they already know how the story ends. I drove home with the envelope on the passenger seat. I did not play music. I went over everything twice in my head, checking for gaps the way I check a load calculation, methodically, from every angle, looking for the place where something might fail. There were no gaps. The day of the hearing, I wore a navy suit and my quietest heels. My attorney, who had reviewed the contents of the envelope the night before, and had gone very still and very focused in the way that I had come to recognize as genuine anger on someone's behalf, sat beside me and made notes in careful, mechanical pencil handwriting. My sister performed beautifully. I will give her exactly that much. She stood at the podium and spoke about grave concerns for public safety, and about patterns of behavior that had troubled the family for years. She described me as secretive and evasive when it came to professional credentials. She spoke with apparent reluctance about the sorrow of having to take action against someone she loved. Her voice broke at precisely the right moment, recovered at precisely the right moment, and she pressed her fingertips to her collarbone when she was finished. A gesture that managed to look like restraint. My mother took the witness stand. She wept. Actual tears, which surprised me, She had always been a dry-eyed performer. She testified that she had never personally witnessed proof of my qualifications, that she only knew what I had chosen to tell her, which she acknowledged was very little, that as a mother, she felt she had a moral obligation to protect the public from potential harm, even when it meant the unthinkable, taking action against her own child. My father was not present. I sat at the defense table with my hands flat on the polished wood and I said nothing. I let them build the architecture of their lie, beam by beam, until it was fully erected and load-bearing, until they were standing inside it. Then Chairwoman Kessler returned to the room. She sat down with the careful deliberateness of someone managing a reaction they have decided the room does not need to see. She placed the secondary folder on the table in front of her. She looked at the assembled parties over the top of her reading glasses for a long, absolutely silent moment. She said that during the recess, the board had cross-referenced the complaint's digital submission metadata against the board's own security audit logs. She said the board had simultaneously, at my attorney's request, pulled the current active record on my professional engineer license, which showed 8 years of continuous, uninterrupted good standing with no citations, no complaints, and no irregularities of any kind. She said, finally, that the centerpiece document of the complaint, a letter bearing a UT Austin letterhead and claiming I had failed to complete my degree requirements, bore the signature of a departmental administrator who had retired from that position 2 years before the date printed on the document itself. The signature was impossible. The timeline was impossible. The document was fabricated. The room went very quiet. My attorney stood up. She slid the manila envelope across the table to the board members. The photographs, the visitor log, the IP metadata. She did not raise her voice. She simply asked my brother-in-law, who was seated in the gallery as a supporting witness, if he would like to explain to the board what he had been doing in a closed licensing board office at 9:47 on a Tuesday night. My brother-in-law had moved through rooms like he owned them for as long as I had known him. He was broad-shouldered and expensively dressed, and he had the particular confidence of a man who had never been asked a question he couldn't redirect. I had watched him work every family gathering for 9 years. He could not work this room. He stood up. He sat down. He stood up again. He said the photographs could have been taken on any night. He said the visitor log signature could have been forged by anyone with a motive to frame him. And I will carry this moment with me for the rest of my life. He turned to my sister and said, with his voice fraying at the edges, that this had been her idea from the beginning, that he had told her it was too far, that he had never wanted to go this far and she had insisted. My sister's face went completely white. The chairwoman did not wait. She picked up her gavel. My brother-in-law was escorted from the room. My sister's attorney leaned over and began speaking to her in a low, urgent voice. My mother sat in the gallery with her silk handkerchief pressed to her mouth, and her eyes very wide and, I noticed, perfectly dry. The chairwoman formally dismissed the complaint with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled under any circumstances. She referred the falsified documentation to the state attorney general's office. She noted for the record that submitting fraudulent materials to a licensing board was a Class A misdemeanor in Texas, and that the nature of the digital filing raised potential federal wire fraud considerations as well. I picked up my bag. I stood up. I walked out of the building into the flat, hot Dallas afternoon. I was not done yet, but they had no way of knowing that. 5 days later, my phone lit up with a notification from security software I had set up 2 weeks before the hearing on a separate device. My brother-in-law had been released on recognizance, pending the Attorney General's review, with explicit written conditions barring him from contacting me, my firm, or any of my professional associates, through any medium. My attorney had insisted on that language being specific and airtight. What I had done was this. I drafted a document that looked, at a careful glance, like a confidential pre-litigation settlement proposal. Official-looking letterhead, dense legal language, the right amount of dollar figures visible through the summary to provoke anxiety, and a secure link to access the full terms. I sent it to my mother's personal email address. The link led to a logging page. Nothing downloaded, nothing installed. The page simply recorded the device, IP address, hardware signature, and GPS location of whoever accessed it. My brother-in-law was at my parents' house when the email arrived. He opened the link on my mother's tablet. The timestamp was precise. The GPS coordinates placed him at my parents' address. The hardware signature matched a device registered to his firm's network. He had violated his release conditions within 5 days. He had done it from his in-law's kitchen, and in doing so, he had created a new count, unauthorized electronic contact with a named complainant in an active state investigation. My attorney received the log at 6:20 in the morning. She filed the violation report before noon. By 3 o'clock, 2 investigators from the Attorney General's office were at my parents' front door. They collected my mother's tablet. They collected the household router. They informed my parents that because the device used to commit the violation was on their home network, both of them were now subjects of a secondary inquiry into potential facilitation. My father called me that afternoon. It was the first time in 4 months. He did not apologize. He said he thought I should know. My mother was very shaken. He said the investigators had been quite aggressive about the devices. He said he hoped I understood that no one had ever intended for things to reach this point. His voice was carefully measured in the way of a man who is frightened but too proud to say so. I listened to all of it. Then I said, I hope you find a good attorney, Dad. I hung up and deleted his contact information. My brother-in-law, facing the weight of both the AG referral and the new violation, hired a separate attorney from my sister and entered a full cooperation agreement. He provided a detailed statement confirming that my sister had originated the plan, had pressured him to leverage his resources to file the false complaint, and had driven the timeline, with the Calder Creek contract as the explicit motive. He gave the investigators dates, communications, and his own role in securing the forged document. He gave them everything that would reduce his exposure and left hers fully intact. My sister, the daughter my mother had spent 36 years selecting, elevating, and protecting, was left without her husband's legal cover, without her parents' financial backing, which had dried up the moment my father understood what subject of inquiry could cost him, and without a coherent story that held together from any direction. The Calder Creek Bridge retrofit remained with my firm. Foundation work began the following spring. I deleted my sister's number, my mother's, my brother-in-law's, not in rage, not with particular satisfaction, with the same deliberate, unhurried motion I use when I clear a finished set of blueprints off my drafting table. When the work is done, you put it away, that's all. People ask me sometimes how I sat in that room and said nothing, while my own family spent 3 hours methodically trying to end what I had spent 8 years building. They want to know if part of me wanted to scream. They want to know if I almost broke. The honest answer is that I was not close to breaking. I was something more functional than that. I was clear. There is a particular kind of clarity that comes when you have already done the work, when the folder is already assembled, when the evidence is already filed, when the only thing left is to let the room catch up to what you already know. In that state, silence is not restraint. It is strategy. It is patience. It is the most powerful thing in the room. There are 3 things I learned from what happened, and from what my family ultimately did to each other, when the structure they built to contain me collapsed inward. The first, love that requires your smallness is not love. My mother poured her attention into my sister the way a bank extends credit, strategically, conditionally, and with a clear exit clause when the return on investment soured. The moment my brother-in-law's cooperation statement made my sister fully indefensible, my mother did not stand beside her daughter. She stood beside the household assets. That is not a mother protecting a child. That is a person protecting a position. Once you understand that some people extend warmth only as far as it serves them, you stop treating their withdrawal as evidence of your failure. It is simply information about their limits. The second, the golden child is the most trapped person in a narcissistic family. My sister spent her entire adult life performing for approval. She was never allowed to simply receive and keep. She had to remain more successful than me to justify being treated as though she were. She had to keep the gap visible. When I won that contract, when I stepped cleanly into a space she believed was preserved for the family's designated achiever, the architecture of her identity threatened to collapse. She did not come after me because she was cruel. She came after me because she was terrified. Understanding that does not excuse what she did. But it means I do not have to carry her fear as though it were my deficiency. The third, the most effective thing you will ever do against people trying to write your story without your permission, is refuse to participate in the narration. Do not explain yourself in rooms full of people who have already decided. Do not defend yourself to audiences who were selected specifically because they will not listen. Document everything in silence. Build your case in private, secure your evidence. And then, when the moment arrives, put it on the table. Let the facts speak at a volume that no amount of performance can compete with. I have a structural engineering firm in Dallas. I have a small house with a fig tree in the backyard that I planted myself 3 springs ago, and that has not asked me to justify its existence once. I have colleagues who refer me by name, and clients who call back. I have a life I built with my own hands, from the inside out, without inheritance, without permission, and without anyone's help. Some mornings I take the long route into the office, and drive past the Calder Creek overpass. They're setting the final support columns this month. I roll the window down. You can smell fresh concrete from the road, that particular clean, mineral smell that means something structural is being made right. I think about my sister occasionally, not with anger, not with satisfaction, with a kind of quiet recognition, the way you note an old scar and remember the wound without reliving the pain of it. I wonder if she ever understood that she was never actually competing with me. I had stepped out of that race years before she filed anything. The only person she was ever genuinely competing with was the version of herself our mother needed her to perform. That is a race no one ever wins. If you have people in your life right now who seem to love you most when you are smaller than your potential, I want you to hear this. Their discomfort with your growth is not a verdict on your worth. It is a measurement of their fear. You are allowed to take that information and act on it. You are allowed to go quiet when everyone expects noise. You are allowed to build something solid in the silence. while they are still waiting for you to beg. You are allowed to simply open the folder. Tell me in the comments. What is one moment when the most powerful thing you did was nothing at all?